A dog was almost exhausted trying to warn a policeman about something when the policeman discovered the truth. It was more terrible than he thought. A crowd gathered slowly on the corner of Maple, where Max, a thin, weather-beaten German shepherd, struggled forward, barely keeping its legs beneath it. Those who stopped to look whispered to each other in confusion and pity. The dog was ragged and underfed, fur matted with dirt, bone visible under taut skin, but there was something oddly arresting about it. Held tightly between its worn, cracked jaws was a doll that almost ragged and covered in grime, as if it had been carried for miles and miles. Poor thing, muttered Mrs. Tucker, a retiree who lived in the apartments just across the street. She looked at the doll, then back at the animal. It's protecting it, isn't it? Looks like it. Her neighbor Ron nodded. He took a step closer. Think it'll let go if we get it something to eat. A young woman, already coming back from a nearby convenience store, approached the dog with a small can of food and a plastic bowl of water. She bent down, gentle and cautious, but the dog only tightened its grip on the doll, pulling it closer as though it expected her to snatch it away. Guess that's a no, she murmured, half amused, half concerned. Look at those eyes. Though he's determined, the dog turned its head towards the direction of the police station down the road. It was only about a block away, its gray brick facade visible from where the crowd had gathered. The dog seemed to take a few more shaky steps forward, its legs trembling under the strain, but kept its course. People moved aside as it continued its march, slow but steady. The doll's dirty yellow dress flopped with each labored step, and with every shake of its worn, scarred body, the dog still managed to hold it firmly, carefully. Even it was a silent determination, one that captured a curious reverence from the bystanders who began trailing behind. Finally, the dog reached the threshold of the police station. It hesitated, swayed, and then, with the last ounce of its strength, it staggered into the doorway and collapsed. Its body lay still, but its jaw clenched around the doll with a steadfast grip, refusing to let go even in exhaustion. Inside, Officer Clark had been filling out paperwork. When the commotion caught his attention, he moved quickly to the entrance and saw the dog on the ground, panting heavily, ribs heaving beneath its filthy fur. The doll was still held tight. All right, buddy," Clark muttered, Ed bending down and gently reaching under the dog's frail frame. He called to another officer, "Get some water, would you?" He carefully carried the dog to the back of the station, placing it on an old wool blanket someone fetched from the storage closet. The dog lay there, barely moving, but its eyes were open, scanning the room. Clark knelt down and offered a bit of water, which the dog finally took, pausing only to glance at the doll. Each time it stopped to lick the bowl, but then, as if driven by some unseen impulse, the dog jerked its head up and fixed its gaze on the wall across from them. It began to growl softly, a low guttural sound, and then the growling turned to barking, first a warning bark, and then a deep, mournful cry that echoed through the station. Its eyes were focused, unblinking, on a large bulletin board plastered with photographs and notices about missing persons and wanted criminals. The doll slipped from its jaws for the first time, but the dog seemed not to notice. Clark watched with a growing sense of unease, exchanging a puzzled look with Officer Riley, who had come over, drawn by the barking. "What's he barking at?" Riley asked. I don't know," Clark said, keeping his voice low, "but he's staring right at the board." The dog, as if it understood the officer's curiosity, placed its front paw on the ground, pushing itself up with what strength remained, then turned to Clark, almost pleadingly. Before looking back at the board, it raised a paw, clanging at the air, as though trying to reach it. All right, let me take a look," Clark said, a strange chill prickling the back of his neck. He approached the board slowly, eyes flicking over the photographs pinned there. As he moved closer, the dog began whining softly, a pitiful, desperate sound that seemed to swell with each step. Clark scanned the photos carefully, and then his gaze landed on one of them, a picture of a 7-year-old girl with soft brown curls and a bright smile, her name printed below, Alice Harper, a 7-year-old girl missing now for 2 weeks. Clark's stomach tightened. He turned back to the dog, whose eyes were locked on him, the despair in them mirroring something dark and painful. Slowly, Clark reached for the picture of Alice and held it up. The dog's gaze followed, unwavering, and it let out a one so broken it sent a shiver down his spine. Clark stood still, his mind momentarily blank as he processed what he was seeing. Clark's spine tingled with an unexpected chill, a feeling creeping up on him that there was. Carefully, and then his gaze landed on one of them, a picture of a 7-year-old girl with soft brown curls and a bright smile, her name printed below: Alice Harper, a 7-year-old girl missing now for 2 weeks. Clark's stomach tightened. He turned back to the dog, whose eyes were locked on him, the despair in them mirroring something dark and painful. Slowly, Clark reached for the picture of Alice and held it up. The dog's gaze followed, unwavering, and it let out a one so broken it sent a shiver down his spine. Clark stood still, his mind momentarily blank as he processed what he was seeing. Clark's spine tingled with an unexpected chill, a feeling creeping up on him that there was something very wrong here. The oddity of it all hit him. A stray, haggard dog, barely standing, had dragged itself into the police station, refusing food and water, clutching an old doll like it was a lifeline. And now it was staring at this picture, barely blinking, as though it could sense something that none of them could. The dog's fixated attention on Alice's photograph felt unsettlingly intentional, almost as if it were trying to communicate. Clark couldn't shake the thought that somehow, in a way he couldn't quite understand, this dog knew something they didn't. He approached the wall, his fingers brushing against the photograph of Alice, his eyes flickering between her innocent smile and the doll the dog still held protectively in its jaws. Clark's stomach nodded. It was just a doll, yet as he looked closer, an uneasy realization crept over him. The doll looked strikingly familiar in the picture. Alice clutched a doll almost identical to the one the dog had dragged in. The dog, noticing Clark's interest, released a low, quiet whine, and then, as if in response to Clark's unspoken question, it stepped forward, lowering the doll to the floor in front of him. Clark's breath caught in his chest. This wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. The battered, dirt-streaked toy had clearly been through a lot, but he could still make out its distinctive blue dress and a small stitched hair on the left arm. Alice's doll. There was no mistaking it. Clark knelt, his hands hovering over the doll, his eyes narrowed in concentration. The scene was unsettlingly silent, broken only by the soft, exhausted panting of the dog. Clark finally reached out, fingers trembling slightly, and picked up the doll. The worn fabric felt strangely heavy in his hands, as if it carried all the weight of the girl's disappearance. He looked back at the dog, who now sat with its gaze fixed intently on him, its dark eyes almost expectant. "Where did you come from?" Clark murmured, more to himself than to the dog, but the dog didn't break eye contact, and its steady, piercing gaze seemed to hold some answer. He was just on the edge of grasping. Clark clenched his jaw, fighting the rising wave of questions flooding his mind. The timing, the doll, the dog's intense fixation on Alice's photo. It was all too much to be random. No, this animal knew something, he was sure of it. Without warning, the dog's demeanor shifted. It let out a sharp bark, then another more insistent one, and nudged at Clark's knee with its muzzle, as if urging him into action. Clark felt a tug at his gut, an undeniable pull. Before he could second-guess himself, the dog leaned in, nipping gently at the hem of his pants and tugging, its gaze darting toward the door. It wasn't a request, it was a demand. The dog wanted Clark to follow, and he had a strange gut-deep certainty that ignoring it wasn't an option. "All right," Clark said softly, more to himself than to anyone else. "Let's see where you're trying to lead me." He cast a glance around the precinct. The faces of his colleagues rang in varying degrees of curiosity and concern. They'd all seen the dog's peculiar behavior, and some of them were still watching, eyebrows raised. But Clark was beyond caring about appearances right now. He gave a slight nod to the others, a silent reassurance that he had it under control, and then he turned back to the dog. The dog gave a final insistent bark and nudged the doll one more time before stepping back, its eyes locked onto Clark's with something almost like urgency. Clark picked up the doll, gripping it tightly in one hand. As he rose to his feet, his heart was thudding in his chest, the kind of low, deep beat that signaled he was on the verge of something he couldn't yet see. He hadn't felt this since the last big case, a kind of electric tension telling him he was standing at the edge of a mystery one he couldn't walk away from. He took a step, and the dog turned immediately, trotting toward the door with a new energy that belled its previous exhaustion. Clark followed, feeling an odd mix of anticipation and trepidation building within him. He glanced back once more at Alice's photograph, the smile frozen on her face So young, so trusting, the doll in his hand felt colder now, the reality of what might lie ahead settling heavily on him. They stepped outside the late afternoon, casting long shadows across. Writhing, muting even the faintest of sounds, the dog barked, suddenly breaking Clark's concentration. It looked up at him, with intense eyes filled with a kind of urgency that was hard to ignore. Clark felt a pang of apprehension, but steeled himself and stepped forward, his hand brushing against the rough surface of the door. It was slightly ajar, wedged tightly between crates and rusted old furniture, as though someone had gone to lengths to make sure it remained hidden. He set to work, carefully moving a broken chair and shoving aside a few musty cardboard boxes. To clear the entrance, the dog waited beside him, silent now, as if sensing that this was where Clark's part began. Taking a deep breath, Clark gripped the door and gave it a pull, the hinges groaning in protest, a sound that echoed unnaturally in the empty alleyway. He stepped inside, and the faint scent of mold hit him immediately, mixed with the bitter tang of neglect and disuse. Clark paused, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light. His flashlight flickered over scattered debris, stained walls, and layers of dust settled over everything untouched. For who knew how long? He swept the light slowly, taking in the chaotic scene: furniture thrown haphazardly, a few overturned chairs, and tattered drapes that hung limply from broken curtain rods. Nothing seemed quite right. The dog brushed past him, drawing Clark's attention to a door at the far end of the room. Clark followed his steps, cautious, his senses on high alert. They reached the door, and this time it was the dog's turn to hesitate, glancing back at him, almost as if asking for reassurance. Clark placed a hand on its head, a quick, instinctive motion meant to calm them both. Then he pushed open the door, and together they descended down a narrow staircase, each step creaking underfoot. The basement air was thick, damp, pressing in from all sides. Clark's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating walls lined with flaking paint, trails of mold creeping up like ghostly tendrils at the bottom. He paused, letting the light sweep over what lay before him. The room was cramped and low-ceilinged, crammed with old mattresses and faded blankets. Cans of food, half open, littered the ground alongside discarded clothes and plastic bags. A sparse collection of what could barely be called belongings, the unmistakable signs of habitation, were scattered everywhere. And Clark's stomach knotted as he realized what he was looking at. This was no shelter, it was a prison, a place meant to hide people, keep them tucked away from sight. But it was the small details that caught his eye, that seemed to shout louder than the rest. Among the debris were passports and documents tossed carelessly onto the ground, their edges creased and smudged. Clark bent down, flipping through them with quick, efficient fingers, a cold horror settling over him as he registered the ages listed on the IDs. All of them were for children, mostly African, no older than 10, their faces staring up at him from the faded photos with expressions of vulnerability. He couldn't ignore. "What the hell?" he muttered, his voice almost swallowed by the oppressive stillness around him. The dog paced beside him, agitated, letting out low, anxious whines, as if urging him to keep moving. Clark swallowed, pushing aside the rising bile. He felt as though he were trespassing in a nightmare, one cobbled together from whispered stories and the worst parts of human nature. His gaze shifted to the far corner of the room, where he saw a pile of small, dusty backpacks, some decorated with cartoon characters, a grim reminder of innocence lost. Clark reached for his radio, his hand trembling slightly. He steadied himself, taking a slow breath. This was just the beginning. Clark's heart thudded as he and Max left the old warehouse, the weight of what they'd found pressing hard on him. The abandoned building with its damp walls and dim flickering light had revealed a chilling truth, pushing down his instinct to recoil. Clark had moved swiftly, snapping photos of the makeshift beds, the small worn-out backpacks, and the scattered children's toys. He knew these items held stories he might never fully understand, stories of fear and longing and separation. He'd secured everything he could, moving quickly but methodically before Max nudged him with an anxious whine, urging him to hurry. Clark took one last glance at the shadows in the far corners, then Max out, his jaw set, ready to bring these revelations back to the station. As they walked back to his car, he looked down at Max, whose fur was slightly matted from the day's work. There was something different about this dog, something almost human in the way he seemed to understand it. Was clear Max wasn't just some lost, aimless stray. No, Max was following an instinct Clark had seen only in trained police dogs. Max's quiet loyalty and focused gaze spoke of purpose, and Clark felt a strange gratitude toward the dog. He'd been skeptical of Max's discovery at first, but now he could sense the urgency driving Max forward. At the station, Clark met the team with a rare quiet intensity. He didn't need to say much. The gravity on his face was enough. He placed the photos on the evidence board, each one drawing an uncomfortable silence from the team as they studied the dilapidated shelter, the clothes, the abandoned toys. One of the detectives, Evans, let out a low whistle. "It's bigger than we thought, isn't it?" Clark nodded. "And more organized than we ever imagined. I have a feeling this warehouse is just a piece of a larger puzzle." He saw their faces, disbelief mingled with dread. This wasn't just a local operation. The conditions and items in that basement hinted at a dark, far-reaching network. Clark turned his focus to Chief Roberts, who had been studying the photos in silence, a deep frown furrowing his brow. "We're dealing with trafficking," Clark said quietly, his voice rough. "Children being smuggled and kept in places like these. Whoever's behind this isn't just operating on our turf. They're connected, and they're organized." The chief looked from the photos to Clark. "You're telling me this could be international?" Clark gave a grim nod. "We need more than just our local resources, Chief. We need Interpol on this. Every sign points to a larger ring. We can't risk missing the bigger picture." The chief sighed, his gaze lingering on the evidence. "I'll make the call. We'll start by looping in Interpol and any agencies with open trafficking cases. This is bigger than any of us imagined." With the go-ahead from Roberts, the station transformed overnight into a hive of relentless activity. Phones rang as officers coordinated with federal and international contacts, and desks filled with notes, maps, and timelines. Clark didn't allow himself to slow down. He stayed immersed, pushing forward every lead. They uncovered the old frayed map on the wall, filled up with pinpoints of potential safe houses, trafficking routes, and connections to other known criminals. This case, he realized, was only beginning to reveal its true extent. As the hours passed, Max, now officially stationed at the precinct, had been making his rounds, quietly observing the team. It was almost as if he knew he was part of this, like he had a vested interest in the outcome. One officer set a small bowl of water near Max's makeshift bed, but Max barely looked away from the action, his eyes following every movement Clark made. Clark, noticing Max's calm alertness, walked over and knelt beside him, scratching the scruffy fur behind his ears. "You found this for us, buddy. This is as much your case as it is ours." He'd never been one for sentiment, but Max wasn't an ordinary dog. Clark sensed that Max had more to tell, that he might hold more secrets about this case than they'd yet uncovered. And Clark had learned long ago that intuition, whether human or animal, was rarely wrong. The late-night hours stretched into dawn. Fatigue crept in, but Clark kept going, driven by thoughts of the families affected. As a father himself, he could only imagine the agony these families were enduring. He thought of his own daughter, safe at home, and a chill swept over him. The idea that children could be stripped of their innocence, caught in the clutches of criminals, with no regard for their humanity. This was personal. Clark clenched his jaw, the resolve burning stronger. He would see this through, not just as a detective, but as a man who could never ignore the silent cries of the young and vulnerable. By morning, the precinct was ready to expand the investigation with federal support. Leads had come in from neighboring towns, small but potentially crucial fragments that could connect the dots, and the team prepared to head out on these new trails. Max sat by Clark's side, his tail occasionally thumping the ground. Clark had come to rely on Max's presence, a silent partner who had, against all odds, become one of their most reliable assets. Evans, who'd been watching Max from across the room, shook his head with a half-smile. "Seems like he was meant to be here." Huh? Clark glanced at Max and nodded, an unexpected pride in his voice. "He's got the instincts. It's like he knows what we're looking for." Evans looked over the evidence.